Drop it, bop it, toss it all around. There's no breaking Nokia, unless, of course, it's breaking up their company as their satellite cellular business got acquired this week. And that's not even the biggest acquisition for communications.
Where there's smoke, there's fire. But where there's fire, there's one less fire tracking satellite, which is a shame because it's the same week we select satellites to find water on the moon, presumably to put out those fires.
All deflectors to the front. The US DoD continues to spend billions of dollars on space defense. Last week, it was space-based interceptors. The week before, it was space domain awareness. This week, it's counter-surveillance.
Welcome to this week's episode of Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Harrison Lambert.
Here with Paul Mayer.
Excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, listen weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal.
This week, our main topics include communications and some major updates there, imaging, and defense. Starting us off in communications, point first, York Space has announced that they're going to be purchasing Allspace for $355 million US. This is something that we've more or less expected to see. York Space indicated that when they went public, they would not only be acquiring Orbion, but they would be looking to continue to acquire other companies. And this is the first one in that sort of line of dominoes that we're seeing play out here. Big picture, the trend here is that York Space is executing on a scope acquisition strategy. We've seen several of these, all of the Rocket Lab acquisitions and York Space's acquisitions. Also, IonQ's acquisitions of Capella Space and the capacity or capability mode that they're building over there as well can all be described as scope style acquisitions. But York Space's acquisition of Allspace falls into that same trend. It's another scope acquisition where they are acquiring additional capability. They're going to allow Allspace to basically continue to run independently. They're going to be a subsidiary of York Space. And what they're acquiring in Allspace is Allspace's suite of mobile ground stations and communications capabilities.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up IonQ and Rocket Lab because I think this is playing into a trend that we're seeing with these acquisitions. It's sort of to the point of consolidation of the industry, but a bit different than we saw like 5-6 years ago, where it was just financially optimizing kind of these companies operating together. It seems this past year or so, a lot of these acquisitions have been setting these companies up to win large defense contracts. So
yep.
You mentioned Rocket Lab. They had bought they had bought a company last year where they got some sort of targeted energy weapon system from them. They just bought Minaric, which plays into York Space's laser communications plays. IonQ bought Capella. They showed up in the Andromeda contract last week. And, we saw something with SciTech going into Firefly. So a lot of these companies are buying up companies that they think will help them win these defense contracts for space defense as the money just comes pouring in for this. And York is also playing into that realm. I think that's kind of why they bought Orbion. It's one of the more critical components to building out constellations, but they seem to have a broader view of how they're playing this, and they seem very focused on the communications layer of all this, which is fair because that's what most of PWSA has been up to this point. We've really only seen like active space defense contracts go out last week with the space-based interceptor program, and even then, a large portion of that is communications with the Link 182 segment of that architecture. So York Space bought Atlas ground stations last year. They're buying Allspace, which is mobile ground stations this year.
Yep.
I think they've identified a huge demand in those sectors that we've been hitting on constantly, with huge amounts of ground stations being stood up, a huge demand for mobile ground stations from the Defense Department, to build out their maritime and their aircraft and, mobile ground station, like the military mobile assets, getting capabilities to connect satellites through those systems. But I think this also positions them well for civil and commercial space. Civil being that they've got the PEXT and the BARD programs through NASA and DARPA, and those have to do with being able to connect to any sort of constellation. So not just their communications constellation and not just the government-owned constellations, but theoretically any constellation, which is it's an important shift that we'll see as a lot of these constellations become more present and proliferated. So they're setting themselves up well ahead of that. I think it also positions them well, particularly with the PEX program, to bid on that TDRS contract that NASA announced they're looking for players for last week, because this will give them kind of that leg up, having already worked on that system, as well as giving them this sort of very broad communications capability that works well with the sort of architecture that TDRS is looking for. So that sets them up great for civil. They've got already a track record with defense. Commercial, we've heard them talk about their M-class being sold. They've sold like 20 of them to some commercial customer. So they're getting some major traction there. So it just seems like they're firing on all cylinders across all domains, all markets, to really nail their communications offerings for space.
Additionally, coming in with our headline item, the Celestial Acquisition Company has agreed to buy Nokia's Module 8 space cellular division. Now, there's a lot going on here that is pretty unique, and I'm excited to jump into it in a little bit more detail. But Nokia effectively announced the intention and then did spin out their Module 8 group into a separate company earlier in spring. That is fairly unique. A lot of sort of corporate R&D and corporate venture efforts wind up looking more like a corporate venture capital arm than they do a corporate venture studio where you're sort of standing up a company. It winds up looking a lot more like, hey, we'll just buy or invest in companies that are developing and building the capabilities that we need. That's more capital efficient on our end. So just off that, just already out of the gate, this is a unique approach from Nokia. Secondly, they're being effectively voluntarily acquired by Celestial Acquisition Company. Now, CAC typically plays, or Celestial Acquisition Corporation typically plays in later stage. In later stage, they've been stood up and they're investing in high growth companies that they see that have a lot of potential in the space industry. That's their thesis. That's what they're investing in. But specifically, high growth typically means growth stage. It typically means a later stage investment, not the venture stage, not the nascent stage, not your seed or pre-seed. It typically means like a Series C, effectively. So Modulate is very much in the seed to Series A stage. They're still very early. Now, granted, they've demonstrated back in 2025, just over a year ago, they demonstrated the ability to create and operate a cellular network on the moon back in, I believe, March of 2025. But they haven't sort of generated any revenues. They haven't acquired any customers as a result of that, but they've demonstrated some impressive technological capabilities. So all of that being said, the Celestial Acquisition Corporation is acquiring them for effectively an undisclosed total price, but it includes and involves about $40 million in debt financing from Scotiabank. So there's a lot about this that is unique and interesting, in large part because a lot of the operations and a lot of the way that this deal has been executed fall in line with the private equity model. So leveraging, going in, buying a company levered up with debt. And then typically the private equity or growth stage play is to grow revenues somewhat, but to do so, but to achieve higher EBITDAs primarily by saving on costs. And so growing revenues is great, but you're also cutting costs while doing so. The Modulate group does not currently have any sort of revenue that can be grown, and it doesn't have a whole lot of costs that can be cut because they are such an early stage R&D team. So there's a little bit of a mismatch seemingly between sort of Celestial Acquisition Corporation's, the playbook that they appear to be using, and the stage of the company that they've acquired. Now, that being said, there could very well be a whole bunch of information that we don't have access to. We don't actually know what the purchase price was. We don't know what the acquisition price was. And we don't actually know what the intended use of this partnership is. The stated use for public facing purposes is to help Modulate grow achieve growth capital, and execute on their technological milestones. We don't know what those technological deliverables or milestones are. So all of this is to say that this is very unique. It seems like on the surface, CAC is investing with a late stage playbook in a very early stage company, which would mean this is going to be a very difficult deal for them to be successful on, just because there's that mismatch there. Now, the alternative to them setting themselves up for a very difficult day at the office is that there's a whole bunch of information where they know exactly what sort of technological deliverables they have to do, and it's just not public-facing information. So there could be some information asymmetry. It also could be a very ambitious swing that's going to be hard to execute on, but we'll just have to see.
I guess my counterpoint to that is that both their customers, Intuitive Machines, as you mentioned, that they flew with last year, so they actually have some flight heritage. And their other customer, Axiom Space, are both Cam Ghaffarian companies. And as we repeatedly say, never bet against Cam Ghaffarian. So I predict this will be a great success for this company. It's definitely interesting coming out of Nokia. This is a play that I see more often come out of companies like Google, where we've had like Lyria, Tara, Loon, companies that kind of set the baseline for a lot of technology that we're now currently starting to see pop up again in space. So we've got Tara and Lyria. They're both actually playing in the space laser communications arena. You have Loon, that was kind of early to the high altitude platform in sector of the industry. But those are companies that get spun out of Google after developing their technology, after getting some early traction, and then building from there. So it's interesting to see Nokia play from that handbook. But I think it's a good move. Nokia has a great heritage. Obviously, they're known for their rugged cell phones, and it seems like they're very specifically targeting some of the more lunar applications for communications, which over the past few months has been noted as a significant shortcoming in our technology capabilities. The U.S. Department of Defense has been putting a lot of focus on that. We talked last week about the Lunar Coordination Office being stood up, the Omega Prime communication satellite Omega Prime surveying satellite being sent out, the LATSO satellites being sent. We have the ignition announcement from NASA talking about lunar ground stations. So there's a lot of infrastructure that's going towards the moon. And one of the key features needed for that is communication. And it's not the same kind of communication as we can do on Earth. We don't have a lot of the radiation protection of the Van Allen belts in the moon. So you really do need some rugged communications and different kind of form factors than what we have on in Earth orbit, because you need to communicate over longer distances, and again in those rugged environments. So I think Nokia has identified a very early but big opportunity for their technology, and from what I've heard about their tech in terms of what they've deployed on Intuitive Machines and what they're contracted for with Axiom, this could be a great play for this spinoff.
The U.S. Space Force has awarded BAE with an $11.2 million contract to demo Golden Dome satellite communications with radios for Link 182. So BAE's Link 182 contract is intended to support resilient communications for LEO constellations. This is, relatively speaking, this is a relatively small contract. That's one of the smaller things that we've seen in the industry here. SpaceX was just awarded, I believe, $57 million for a separate Link 182 solution. But it's great to see Blink 182 back in force here from BAE Aerospace. The deliverable for the contract here is going to be, I believe, April 30th, 2027. So just under a year here to effectively provide the resilient communications hardware and solutions necessary for the LEO constellation going up.
Yeah, this is a interesting win for BAE because, like you said, SpaceX just won it last week, but they won it for their Starlink, just repurposing their Starlink network for defense communications, which I found odd since they have Starshield and they didn't specifically call out Starshield. So it seems like it's kind of a dual use purpose. I don't know if Link 182 is meant to have like multiple communication segments, because BAE sounds like it's more of a radio thing. which would just communicate with the space component. So I don't know why the government wouldn't just use Starlink terminals if they're planning to use Starlink in the first place. But it could just be that, BAE has a better product offering, or they can modify it to be more, cyber secure, more resilient to whichever battlefield domain they're deploying to. But it is also interesting to see that BAE is playing more of a role in Golden Dome, at least this quickly off the back of that SBI contract last week, which is kind of the first clear award from Golden Dome. At the same time, they were talking about doing space defense satellites alongside, not with Lockheed, but BAE and Lockheed both announced they're going to be working on space defense satellites. So it seems BAE is tackling this Golden Dome initiative on multiple fronts. Makes sense. They're a very large defense contractor, so they can afford to just try to bid on everything. But it seems like, they're interested in doing the communications layer, which is a huge portion of it, as well as doing some of the more on space based defense and awareness capabilities.
Closing out on the communications side, we get to talk about Viasat and their F3 satellite that went up, which is the third of a 3-satellite constellation that's going up. So the Viasat's F3 was designed to deliver 1 terabit per second of throughput, and was successfully launched and commissioned earlier this week. The satellite is going to be focusing on servicing the APAC region and will begin its orbit ascension with an anticipated service start date sometime in the next 60 to 120 days. Basically, as soon as it does over the next several months, elevate to its geostationary orbit, then it'll start working. It's already powered on and deployed its solar cells, so now it just has to climb to its final geostationary orbit.
Yeah, this is great because this is the third of the Viasat 3. I don't know if I call it constellation group of satellites. These are very impressive satellites. They're 25 kilowatts, which, still holding the record after K2 launched their 20 kilowatt satellite last week. Terabyte per second is pretty top of the line. The constellations in low Earth orbit can't do this yet, although Starlink's supposed to in the next generation. So Viasat really kind of holding their lead here. The 3 satellites are equally spaced around in geo, so it should provide global coverage at 1 terabit per second. That's a really solid offering. I think primarily focused towards business, enterprise technology. So putting up a fight against the likes of Amazon Leo and AST Space Mobile and some Starlink offerings, but it's a solid showing by an old school geocom provider. Some really cool tech on there. They got some really neat deployable radiators too. So just a really impressive satellite. I'm glad all 3 got up safely and fine.
Well, we'll know that all 3 have gotten up safely in about 3
That's true. That's true. There's the Spanish satellite, but a meteorite on its way out late last year. So it was a Hispasat manufactured satellite, but it was like a Spanish government satellite. Spainsat NG2, I think.
I can't remember the exact name, but I remember Hispasat, and that during its ascent, the belief is that it got hit by a little micrometeorite that punched something out and caused failure.
Yeah,
but
so hopefully I didn't call success too soon, but it is nice to see them all up there.
Hey, this is a great milestone.
Yeah. So on the imaging side, we've got a bit of deja vu. DARPA announced they've selected 3 companies for LASSO. If you'll remember, last week we announced that Benchmark had claimed they won a contract for LASSO. I guess they jumped the shark a bit because DARPA hadn't officially announced everything yet. But now the other 2 winners are known, being Quantum Space and Revolution Space. There's not a lot to be known about Revolution Space. Their site is very sparse, and DARPA did not announce their architecture publicly, so not much we can talk about there other than that they work on advanced space solutions, and it seems like their focus is in propulsion, which pretty much falls in line with what we're seeing with the other 2 companies. Last week we talked about Benchmark doing their hybrid electric chemical thruster, which was really unique propulsion solution, and Quantum Space being another camera-firing company. So really hammering home our point that Cam Gafarian always wins. This is a huge contract for Quantum Space. They haven't had a lot in terms of contracts recently. The biggest news coming out of them was their acquisition of Phase 4, or at least parts of Phase 4 late last year. So another very unique propulsion offering, which kind of ties the trend across these three companies for this program. LASSO is the low lunar orbiting surveying satellite for lunar water. Specifically, they're looking for hydrogen at above a certain concentration. It's a large signifier that water is there. So it's kind of a dual purpose mission. The NASA side of things is mainly surveying for water, so they can use that to plan out their lunar sites. But why DARPA is involved is primarily around the propulsion side of things. Low lunar orbit is a very unforgiving orbit, and one we haven't worked in a whole lot. The gravity gradients there are way crazier than on Earth. There's harsher environment in terms of radiation, and just overall it requires a lot more technology that we don't really develop in low Earth orbit, geo orbit. So DARPA is very interested in proving out these different kinds of propulsion capabilities, not just for NASA's future lunar efforts, but also for some of these lunar defense capabilities that have been coming up more recently, like we said, with the Lunar Coordination Office standing up, space situational awareness for space, but also some of these space defense capabilities for defending space assets around lunar orbit as it becomes more congested with other nations as well.
Yeah, the Lunar Assavius Small Satellite Orbiter it's not to compare it to the Apollo programs in that it's certainly not a moonshot, though it's much closer to a literal moonshot than not. But the mission here, a big part of what needs to happen is sort of, to your point, the technological solutions to problems that we currently have not solved. So it's going to be fascinating to see how much of a priority this is able to get, given some of the sort of top-down initiatives and top-down priorities that we've heard about getting permanent bases and presences on and around the moon, and starting to incorporate the cislunar economy into the space economy as a whole. So the fact that there is now such a robust space economy to back this means that the solutions, the technological advances that are made in getting us to and on the moon will have an immediate multi-trillion-dollar market to tap into in the really expansive now space economy that we never had back in the 60s, 50s, 70s.
On the more terrestrial side of things, we have some unfortunate news coming out of Canada, in that the government of Canada has terminated their contract with Spire Global for the Wildfire Sat. This is a $72 million program, although I saw that upon completion it's worth over $100 million. So a big loss for Spire, although it was terminated for convenience, which is quite different than terminating for cause. So it wasn't that there was some shortcoming on Spire's part, but it just seems that the appetite for this satellite might have waned. Although Canada is saying that they're still pursuing this, so it might just be a mismatch of goals between Spire and the government. Spire is primarily focused on maritime communications capabilities, so this is a bit outside of their wheelhouse. Although they have quite a history of developing spacecraft, so certainly capable of it. But just from reading the tea leaves here, it seems like it might just be something Spire doesn't really want to have to focus on. Typically with these things that are out of character for core business, it just requires a lot of non-recurring engineering and support costs, and just distracts from the core purpose. And Spire's been doing really well with maritime communications, and it's a growing industry in and of itself. So being kind of a pure play company, my feeling here is that Spire just didn't see the value, even though they did say this was like a profitable contract for them. I'm guessing they just want to stay focused on their core business proposition here. It is unfortunate they're already a year into this, so it sets back the whole program. And wildfires are something I'd love to see monitored more. There's several other companies that pursue it. Muon has their wildfire sat that they've been deploying. Loft partners with SmartSats to do some wildfire monitoring that I work on. And Aurora Tech is kind of the big one here, because they were the payload providers for Spire. And they're also flown on Kepler's spacecraft. Just earlier this year, Kepler launched a couple of Aurora Tech satellites on board to provide real-time monitoring, something that Spire wouldn't be able to do with their satellites. They would just have RF communications. So maybe it's a matter that could be another factor here in that Aurora Tech sees a better opportunity with a different bus provider and just wanted to pull out of this contract. And without them, this whole thing kind of falls apart. Kepler is another Canadian company, so it could just be that Canada shifts to Kepler and says, okay, now you guys provide wildfire sat, since you already basically are with 2 Aurora Tech equipped satellites on orbit. I think that makes a lot more sense in terms of partnership, rollout, capability, everything. So my guess here is that soon we'll see this contract pop back up, but under Kepler's name. Yeah, the company that I'm kind of surprised isn't already playing in this wildfire arena is Planet, given how many satellites they have up already. But they did announce this week that they're now partnering with Carbon Mapper to use their Tanager spacecraft for methane tracking. So love to see it. More climate monitoring, environmental assistance from space. Methane tracking satellites have taken a hit in the past year. GHGSat lost their capabilities. So it's good to see another company stepping in to fill that sort of gap. Although there are others, Planet is a very large company, so it's great to see them using their Tanager spacecraft, which is a brand new spacecraft, to help out here. Tanager is hyperspectral, which means it operates amongst, I think it's like up to 100 bands. For this particular use case, they're using the shortwave infrared band to look for that methane signature. Carbon Mapper is the company that contracted and will handle all the applications there. So it's great to see Tanager having kind of an anchor customer here and Planet expanding out into other different buses, because up till now we've basically seen Doves, Super Doves, and Pelicans flying, although Tanager is kind of the next level for them. They've also got some AI satellites that they've already launched some, but I know there's some future bus designs as well. So great to see some of these getting use cases laid out and having timelines locked in. On the defense side of things, we have some huge news out of True Anomaly. True Anomaly raised a $650 million Series D. This now values them at over $2.2 billion after raising a total of $1 billion across those 4 rounds. This is particularly impressive given that they also won part of the contract for the SBI, the Space-Based Interceptor program under Golden Dome, like a day before they announced this raise. So we saw it similarly with Turion Space the week before, where they won the Andromeda contract and then immediately closed a $65 million round. True Anomaly went, hold my beer, let me add an extra 0 there, and closed this massive raise off the back of their win on a government contract. This isn't the first win for True Anomaly. They've been operating under the Victus Haze mission for a few years now. They've launched their Jackal satellite on a Firefly Alpha, and will be doing it again for the next stage of Victus Haze, where a Millennium-built spacecraft will pursue their target spacecraft in a demonstration of space defense capabilities. So True Anomaly is a space defense company. They're focused on space situational awareness as well as primarily space defense capabilities through their satellite. They have a few different variants of Jackal, which is a highly maneuverable and RPO capable satellite. They just launched a Jackal on the Falcon 9 launch this week that we're going to talk about. So they've got some real momentum behind them. That's a huge win for them and a whole lot of money to help them execute.
True Anomaly has raised an absolute boat of capital here, but they've managed to do so on such consistent and high growth that the downside to potentially being an early stage investor in True Anomaly is not that you're looking at a 35x potential exit, but that if you put in, for example, $1 million in each of the rounds, because that's the capital that you had available to you, you are looking at potentially, if I'm doing my math right, between 90 and 95% dilution because of how capital intensive it is, which would mean that your 70x potential exit would wind up looking a little bit closer to a 3 to 7x exit, which for most VCs, 10x exit is sort of the threshold here. So putting $1 million at each of these different raise rounds wouldn't have done anything. You would have needed to put in sort of, if you wanted to put in $1 million in the seed round, that would have been for, well, we'll just say it was for 20% of the raised capital. That means that in order to maintain that same level of hold, you would have needed to put in another $200 million over the course of the company's survival in order to be able to maintain your current share of the equity stack. So there's very few people who would have wanted to do that. And if you do that and you put in that 200 million bucks, that changes the IRR calculation overall. So your IRR winds up not being 70 million or not being 70x. It winds up being closer to like 5 or 6x. But still a very lucrative and very valuable raise for everybody at True Anomaly and everybody involved. Though the sheer magnitude of the capital raise means that folks who were looking to get in a little bit earlier will have needed a little bit more powder to maintain and defend that position going up.
So the United States Space Force also awarded some other contracts on top of the Andromeda and SBI contracts over the past couple of weeks, also in the vein of space defense, but kind of in a new sector that hasn't been brought up before. And that is in the sector of counter surveillance tech. So we hear about this sometimes in terms of cybersecurity and a little bit in terms of the Starlight system that Rocket Lab equipped to Tranche 3 of PWSA to defend against directed energy weapons. But this is to detect when a geo spacecraft is being surveilled by a radar system on the ground. Why that's that important, I'm not quite sure, other than just knowing. Maybe just to be able to take that out. Not that the satellite itself can take it out. And if they move around, it's not like they can evade a radar system. But I think it's primarily to know if some maneuver performed by a geospacecraft was known by an adversary. And this kind of need comes from a growing demand for geo maneuverability and defensibility after China performed some geo RPO capability tests mid last year with their Xi'an, Shijian satellites. But Russia also has shown this capability with the Luch Olymp satellites. There were 3 series of tests from the Western allies across the US and France and UK to demonstrate a similar technology. All this to say that the space environment in geo is heating up a lot faster than anybody really anticipated, because up until recently, most people thought they were just so far out, such a big orbit, that it was just not going to be feasible for anybody to kind of mess with assets that far out. But now that adversarial nations have shown that's capable, or that's possible, then suddenly these big juicy targets that are hundreds of millions or billions of dollars are now susceptible to attack by a foreign adversary. So all that taken into account, I think the ability to detect when somebody's being tracked by radar kind of gives these systems a heads up that somebody's looking at them, likely with the intent to attack them, and therefore trigger some sort of defensive capability, which we talked about with True Anomaly just now, is one of their key technologies, being able to defend these spacecrafts from attack, particularly physical attack by other satellites. So the contracts coming out for this were $3 million each to Assurance Technology, Raptor Dynamics, and Innovative Signal Analysis. These are phase 1 contracts, so pretty small, just to investigate the architecture and prove out that it closes. Then they can move on to phase 2, likely with not all the companies, but whichever companies demonstrated a useful architecture that the United States Space Force wants to pursue. The most interesting company amongst these 3 is Innovative Signal Analysis. This is the company that got acquired by Cesium Astro earlier this year after they closed a huge funding round through the Export-Import Bank of America, kind of in that American Defense Fund effort. And it's interesting to see them win this contract, as Cesium Astro is pretty focused on building out a LEO constellation of communication satellites. So to have them working on a geo counter surveillance technology is a bit odd, although I'm sure this tech can be applied to LEO satellites. And if if Cesium is pursuing defense applications with these big, large communication satellites they're building, this will likely have dual benefit to their own personal assets as well as the government. Back to the more traditional sense of space defense, the space situational awareness side of things, Space Flux has raised £9 million, led by Blackfinch Ventures. Space Flux is a space situational awareness company. It is interesting that Space Flux existing contracts, the biggest one is with MDA Space, which is the Canadian space company. They are contracting to be the space-based ground optics supplier for space situational awareness, which could play well with the space defense satellite they were talking about building out recently using their Aurora platform. So good partnerships here, solid raise by them. I think they're playing in a really hot space right now. I feel like every week we talk about a new company getting funded to do this sort of technology, but not many of them come from the UK. So great to see that.
On to our lightning round for the day here. The first announcement that we're excited to chat about here is that Seraphim Space, who recently hit their milestone and their goal of raising 100 million back in February, are seeking an additional 350 million pounds, 454 million US, after showing a year-over-year return of 278%. So the Seraphim Space Investment Trust has had fabulous returns, 278% over the past year, 411% over the past 3, and an 88% return quoted since its inception. So pretty darn good returns on a regular basis here. And the funds that they're looking to raise here for the basically $500 million round are going to be used to both support existing portfolio companies near exit. They have, I believe, 80 to 85% of their portfolio is either EBITDA positive or very close to EBITDA positive, which is a pretty good indicator that a venture is nearing exit. And secondly, they want to make more, or they want to continue to grow and scale their Seraphim Accelerator program, which has been sort of their bread and butter. It's been how they've been getting involved in the space industry, how they've been investing and getting their footholds in the space industry has been through their very targeted accelerator program. And third, they want to enter sort of growth stage investments, leveraging their early stage and accelerator deal flow. And so this is great progress and growth for the team. And as we've sort of spoken about previously, broad strokes, smaller deals overperform larger deals. The larger the deal gets, the less sort of juice there is to squeeze. And typically once deals start getting too big, you start to overspend and overpay here and there. So there's a reason to sort of not expect 400% returns over the next 3 years for this fund, just by the nature of getting into later stage and bigger deals where the total potential juice left to be squeezed is going to be a little bit lower. Additionally, because they're getting into sort of the growth stage when they've been so early in venture stage, primarily with the entirety of their product offerings to date, there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. So not only are they going to be spending more time in sort of higher magnitude, but overall lower margin deals. But this is a little bit different from the stuff that they've done previously. So there's probably going to be a little bit of a learning curve there. So I would expect to see the SSIT's returns dip as far as like percentage and return IRR and sort of those return metrics go. But I would expect to see the sheer value of money return, the sheer number and magnitude of returns distributed and value created to continue to grow as they continue to scale the capital that they're deploying and working with and continue to help their companies scale. Seraphim will undoubtedly continue to succeed here at what they're doing. Just the 411% returns over the last 3 years are absolutely outstanding, and we should not expect like that is top 10th, top decile sort of returns, a major overperformance of what anybody's expectations could be. And so as Seraphim enters sort of new uncharted territories for them, those numbers are probably going to come down a little bit, but I would expect them to still be doing and performing very well.
Yeah, it's impressive returns, especially given the fact that Seraphim is one of the leading pure space investors in Europe, and European space has been slow to kind of grow. It's accelerated over the past couple of years, given the current state of the U.S. and our relationship with Europe, but that would only explain the past couple of years. So the fact that they're seeing returns even without this catalyzing factor is very impressive. And I would only expect to see it grow further. I thought it was really interesting this week that there was like a pair of articles that came out from Payload and Space News that were talking about the investment environment in Europe. And they basically had conflicting conclusions or theses, which was basically that Payload was saying Europe spent like 1.4 billion. They're doing great. They're funding everything. And Space News goes on to extrapolate that, well, most of the funding for European space is actually coming from the US. So they're really not as decoupled from the US as they would like to be. So it's great to see that there's even more money getting poured into the European space industry through the likes of venture capital. I hope to see this emulated elsewhere, particularly with investment firms that aren't purely space-based, as we've been seeing more of often. But it's really the groups like Seraphim that are out front leading the charge.
First team of the breach. Gotta love it.
Yeah.
Additionally, Cosmoleap has raised 500 million yuan, 73 million US, led by Changhai Arc and Papua Capital. The raise is intended to get the reusable rocket company through their debut launch in 2027. The launch date hasn't been finalized yet, so unclear exactly as to when that's planned, but they've got the sort of tower catch and recovery ground station that they're going to be launching from, and the vehicle is designed to take 12,000 kilograms to LEO orbit after recovery of the first stage, which would bring the total sort of payload that they're moving up, including the to 18,000 kilograms.
Yeah, this is just continuing the impressive speed at which China is deploying capital to stand up their launch vehicle capability. There's a dozen or so companies that are working on reusable rockets in China, and even without any of them being fully operational yet, China's still able to launch over 100 rockets a year, which is a really impressive cadence. Having really only one rocket that's operating at that speed, somewhat comparable to the U.S. having SpaceX being the only one that's operating at that cadence. But SpaceX is a reusable rocket. The rocket that's most used in China is the Long March, which is not reusable except in one variant, but that variant's also not operational yet. So great to see more companies being funded that are pursuing this reusable aspect. It is interesting to see that they're using this tower recovery method. It reduces the total mass that has to be lifted by the rockets, since they don't need landing legs or anything. But it is funny that they're kind of taking from SpaceX's Starship design and applying it to an earlier kind of iteration. Whereas it wouldn't make a lot of sense for companies like Blue Origin or SpaceX to redesign the New Glenn and the Falcon to use this architecture. But China is kind of benefiting from being, second mover advantage of learning from its competitors and integrating those improvements into their iterations.
SpaceX's CAS 502, the title of the launch that went up just after midnight Sunday morning, launched 45 satellites. That includes the namesake of the mission, the CAS 502, the Korean satellite that was initially intended to launch back in 2022 off of a Soyuz, I believe, but that launch got massively delayed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Additionally, and I think most notably on the launch, were the 6 Earth daily satellites for Earth imaging that I believe you had the privilege of working on, Harrison. So I'm sure you're excited to see those go up and to chat about what you were working on there. But
yeah.
Additionally, there were a bunch of HEOSATs and some Planet Pelicans that went up, and notably the True Anomaly Jackal, their True Anomaly sort of autonomous spacecraft. They held the launch. It was supposed to launch at 10 p.m. Saturday evening, but they held it another 2 hours until True Anomaly could actually close their $650 million Series B so that they could launch this directly on the back of closing it. So very considerate of SpaceX there. But joking aside, True Anomaly's Jackal went up almost immediately after they announced the close of their Series D on the midnight launch. So congratulations to them.
I can get to the one I'm excited about, but yeah, like you said, Jackal, really great. I think it's the first time they've launched on Falcon 9. Like I said, they usually launch on the Firefly Alpha as part of Victus Haze, but it's good to see they're increasing their cadence. I mean, Alpha isn't operational; those launches were just to show rapid turnaround. It was like within 24 hours deployment.
Sure.
So it looks like Jackal's getting deployed more often in order to test out their systems. I don't think this was under contract for anything. But great to see. HEO in the same vein, very impressive. They had like 6 different satellites, and they've been growing pretty fast. I talked about them recently with like the Satellogic, where they like bought a Satellogic satellite that was on orbit, And I've been seeing so many pictures from their satellites of other satellites, because they do space-based space situational awareness, and they're an Australian company. So they're demonstrating some very impressive capability for a technology that's kind of nascent in the US. Like Vantor does it, but pretty much everybody else is in the exploration stage. Like we've talked about the Andromeda contract a couple weeks ago. All those companies are kind of capable of it, but aren't at the point that HEO is. So HEO is just moving at an incredible speed. On that same vein, I mean, Planet's moving very quickly. They're a much more established company, but these Pelicans are kind of their bigger next generation, higher resolution spacecraft. So great to see more of those going up, as you know, Black Sky version 3 and Vantor Worldview Legion. Like those are doing very good numbers in terms of contracts. So I'm sure the more Pelicans Planet can put up, the better for their bottom line. And the one I'm most excited about is Earth Daily has launched 6 satellites. Earth Daily is contracted under Loft Orbital, where I work. So these are imaging satellites that Loft has integrated onto their bus and launched for Earth Daily to integrate to their constellation. To get their full constellation on orbit, the goal of their company is to have imagery of the entire Earth every day. So it's a Canadian company. They have a very unique architecture, as you can see from the pictures of this Falcon 9 launch. And they just recently got approved to be a U.S. government imaging provider, which is huge for them. So I think they stood up Earth Daily Federal to do that. So definitely a great capability. Great to see a lot of companies kind of building out a lot of imaging capability across most of these. There's also like Galaxy, which was I forget the name of their mission, but it was Galaxy's first satellite. That's an Indian synthetic aperture radar company. So yeah, just a lot of companies like doing some awesome stuff, getting capabilities sped up and reaching cadence, and just love to see it.
Finally, on the business development side of things, Russia has debuted their Soyuz 5 rocket. It is effectively a replacement of prior available capabilities. But the launch went off without a hitch, launching out of Kazakhstan. So Russia will once again be able to provide what they've been providing for a good little while, though a lot of the challenges that the Russian launch market and launch economy have experienced over the past several years are due largely to their invasion of Ukraine, and their sort of geopolitical standing doesn't represent enough new or novel launch capacity or launch capability to most likely warrant reconsideration by any of their prior launch or previous launch partners or potential customers. So we'll have to see how this winds up sort of re-entering into the space economy here, re-entering into the launch market. But it's still a net positive to see an additional launch provider proving out their technology and getting back to market.
I like that Russia's new rocket is actually an old rocket. It finally gives us a space industry that we can trash talk, because I don't like trash talk in the US, and China's too impressive to trash talk. So Russia, pull together, man. But yeah, to your point, like the Zenit is a rebuild of an old rocket. They're now calling it Soyuz 5 to fit it into their main lineup of rockets. The Zenit had a rocket engine that was built by the Ukrainians. So now that they're at war with them, they can't exactly get the supplies for it. Why do they want this rocket again is a little unclear. I think it's just to add extra lift capacity to their arsenal of launch vehicles. To me, the main thing, it's a bit weird because it's launching out of Baikonur. But I think the main thing to me is that they're trying to get the Rassvet constellation up. Rassvet is the Russian variant of, Russian alternative to Starlink. As Starlink was shut off to the Russian military like last year and caused a whole bunch of turmoil. And since then, they've been trying to build out their own communications constellation to not be reliant on an American communication constellation while they're at war with an American ally. That was a lot of drama this week because they're actually launching it on different Soyuz out of the Plesetsk launch base that's up northern Moscow. And they actually got attacked by Ukraine at that base as they were trying to launch their satellites. So a bit of geopolitics in the Russian space industry, trying to get enough launch vehicles to get enough satellites up to continue their conflict, but at the same time being directly challenged by the people they're in conflict with to stand up that capability. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting.
I'm sure if they asked nicely, Ukraine would be happy to give them as many of the Zenit rockets as they wanted.
Oh my God.
They might not like how they're delivered, but I'm sure they'd be happy to provide.
Direct delivery to Moscow.
Door to door. I'm sure they'd be very happy to do that.
So on the tech advance side of things, this week we have some really, really neat news. Meta, I always find that name weird. Facebook, Meta, Instagram, whatever you want to call them. They bought a gigawatt of power from Overview Energy. This is kind of the first large contract like this we've seen for space-based solar power. And with ground-based solar power being priced around 20 cents per kilowatt, this could potentially be a $20 million contract from a very big name that traditionally doesn't buy in the space industry. They've tried Facebook at the time when they were trying to do it. It was Facebook. They were trying to launch communication satellites like 10 years ago. So they're not entirely new to space, but this is a pretty new play for space. It has a lot of implications for space-based solar power. It kind of validates one of the core value propositions of space-based solar power, as well as it has implications for terrestrial data centers. There's been kind of this back and forth between orbital data center industry and space-based solar power industry as to which one makes more sense, generating the power on orbit and then beaming it down to terrestrial data centers, or just moving the entire terrestrial data center up to space and operating it there.
Sure.
I'm a bit more on the side of space-based solar power. It does seem like there's less fervor behind it, so they're progressing slower in terms of technology and deployment. But this to me is a huge sign that there is some demand for it. And as long as they can deliver on this, there's more demand to follow. So this is a really exciting development for this company. They're one of about a dozen space-based solar power companies, one of the newer ones too. So this is great traction for them. And I hope to see more like it, especially from other data center providers as well. On the space-based on the other side of that argument is the orbital data center side, and there's been a update on that side from DeFi, who is flying a Cluster Gate 2 mission on board of Vigoride 7, which is another satellite I worked on that launched a few weeks ago. So I'm very excited to be able to talk about a couple of different satellites that I've worked on in orbit. But this particular mission is a GPU that's flown on the spacecraft that is able to run different models to demonstrate their capability on orbit. We had kind of talked about it a few weeks ago when we interviewed Satellite, as they have their AI loaded on there as well. But the one that ran this week was actually Liquid AI's large language model. So they used a large language model AI to classify an image of Earth. I don't believe it was actually taken from the spacecraft, but it was used on orbit. So they can claim that they are the first large language model flown in space. That may seem like a small distinction to make, as there's other AIs that have run in orbit. We've talked extensively about imaging companies using classification AIs, but that's slightly different than an LLM. There has been small language models like Gemma, and that's one that we talked about with Satellite, and I believe that's the one StarCloud ran on their StarCloud 1. And there are arguably an LLM that ran with DeepSeek running on Ada Space's satellite over in China. So a little wishy-washy on who can claim first, but this is a big step, not just for DeFi, but the whole orbital data center sector at large. In the other advanced space sectors of on-orbit manufacturing, we have BioOrbit closing a $13.2 million seed round. This is an impressive raise for a company that's done one launch and has another one upcoming, so they're fairly early. But they're working on some pretty cool stuff. They're trying to do pharmaceuticals on orbit with a focus on cancer therapeutics, although their business case seems focused on developing any sort of drug that would be valuable enough on Earth that warrants being manufactured in space. They launched previously on a space exploration Nix satellite, although that satellite had a failure, so they were never able to complete that mission. This time around, later this year, they're going to be flying on the ISS to prove out their capability. If they can prove out their manufacturing capability, they can start exploring other applications for it, start developing new drugs that they can then return to Earth and sell at a markup because they'll be more effective, longer dosage, just better all around due to the benefits of manufacturing microgravity.
Yeah, I actually got the chance to speak with Doctors Mulligan and Savin from BioOrbit's US branch out in Colorado for Space Symposium. And the business model that they're leveraging is effectively developing the IP necessary to create and scale new products and new drug offerings. They're to your point, they're focusing on that specific sort of cancer therapeutic market. What they're doing is something that we have yet to see at scale, but that we've seen other folks sort of dabble in. It's great to see somebody looking at working in this space as a primary core product offering here. Though interestingly enough, the conversation that we had, they mentioned that they're not currently looking at working with Fast. They're not currently looking at working with any of the folks who will currently provide downmass solutions. Their current plan is to just work with the capacity offered on the ISS, which we've spoken with multiple people who are creating both upmass and downmass solutions. So they create the test bed, they build out sort of the orbital laboratory, but don't have any intention of building out or establishing their own sort of logistics solutions. So they're going to be partnering with whatever sort of logistics solutions there are, though they're starting with the ISS because that's what actually meets their needs to the best of that's what meets their needs most closely. So that's the best fit that they currently have. But it'll be interesting to see whether or not the ISS continues to serve as sort of the bottleneck that we've seen it serve for other folks in this sort of microgravity manufacturing space.
And the last piece of news for this week is one that I found particularly interesting. There's no direct business implication, but it is a huge advancement in a key technology that's both important for orbital data centers as well as interplanetary travel, which is that of radiation shielding. The Extreme Environment Shielding Materials Research Center of the Korea Institute of Science and Technology this week published a research paper about a new shielding material that they developed. It is a carbon nanotube material that consists of two different carbon nanotubes. One is the carbon nanotube that protects against electromagnetic radiation. This is particularly useful for missions that fly outside of low Earth orbit, where the Van Allen belts can't protect you against that sort of radiation. And this, as they say, it's 100% protection, so it's just as good as being protected by that or some sort of metallic shielding. And the other nanotube is a boron nitride nanotube, and this is able to protect 70% against neutrons, which are some of the high energy particles we get from the sun, which are very impactful against electronics and geo and interplanetary travel. These are both very impressive metrics for any material. But on top of that, this material is as thin as a hair, it is flexible, and it is actually 3D printable, which makes it a very, very dynamic solution for protecting things against radiation. This, as I said, could be good for interplanetary, not just protecting computers or important electronics against damage from these high energy particles or electromagnetic radiation, but also from humans. There hasn't been a really great solution for habitation on other planets, or even any sort of spacesuit for long duration space flight, mainly because of the mass requirements required for proper shielding, like aluminum. The amount of aluminum you need would be very massive to support that kind of shielding. Right. So having something that's this small, this light, this flexible is a huge improvement. And I really hope to see that this gets commercialized in some way. And we get to see it making an impact soon on a lot of these missions that we're seeing stood up for lunar exploration could benefit hugely from this.
Yeah. Radiation shielding as mass efficient as what they're claiming is a truly impressive feat. It already represents massively improving and solving the problems that we've already spoken and articulated we will need to solve and overcome in order to create and develop the cislunar economy that we're clearly driving and building towards. Well, that is a wrap for this week's recap of the space industry. We certainly hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this is Paul Mayer and Harrison Lambert signing off for now.